but hopefully I can provide some insight into my practice within the confines of the population I work with in the English football. ACL reconditioning strategies is a topic I'm really passionate about. And I'm going to talk today about the case study or the clinical example of the question, when can I run? Which is what we all get asked by athletes. And of course, return to running is not our sole focus as we navigate with the athlete through the journey of an ACL program. And I really want to make that clear. Of course, there's a much broader project going on. But I want to use this case study as an example of breaking down differing sport-specific skills and identifying the physical, biomechanical, and technical demands of these skills to help hone in on the detail of our program design. So slightly different to going into specific data, more of a philosophy and approach to the rehabilitation process, and how I might clinically reason through the content of my program to ensure that each day we're giving the athlete the biggest bang for their buck with the hours they're putting in at the club. So what I can then do is try to ensure from day one of injury, we are priming the athletic qualities required for those early running sessions. And that's not me being a sprint coach, because I'm not, and that's not my skill set, but it's having an understanding of the basic principles underpinning human movement, loading, and motor learning. So just to give you some background in the cohort of athletes I work with, by summarising the current state of play in the Premier League with regards to ACL injuries. So we can see that over the last 10 years, there's been 99 ACL injuries, averaging 10 a season. And this isn't increasing or decreasing, but fluctuating on a season upon season basis. A club may get anything from none to 3 ACL injuries a season. And there's currently a huge spectrum of return to sport timeframes, ranging from 5 to 18 months. And this could be an indication of injury severity in the longer cases, but also individual circumstances and different return to sport pressures. Now, 96% of Premier League players will return to playing in the Premier League. And this is really high if you compare it to a sub-elite level, where maybe only 65% of athletes will return to their pre-injury level. So that shows us we're doing something right. But then we can see we've had 5 ACL re-injuries within the last 5 years. So there's definitely room for improvement, I think. Now, 9 months has to be considered the minimum time frame to return these guys back. We have enough evidence now to support this and justify this. Is it because of a biological and tissue healing and the graft maturation perspective, or is it just the time resources we need to restore normal athletic function? But what we do know is that either way, returning prior to 9 months just isn't negotiable in the majority of cases. And I appreciate there will be individual circumstances to each case. And then identifying who's susceptible to these re-injuries, well, we know it's incredibly difficult to identify those at risk. And of course, it's multifactorial. Genetics, graft selection, surgical technique, physical rehab, perceptual capacity, decision-making ability are some of the factors that we have to consider. So why are we concerned about returning to running? How many cases do we see when we've heard of the athlete returning to the field for the first time, and the next day they come into the physio room with a knee fused, stiff calf, stiff lower back? This is a sign we just haven't fully restored their athletic capacities to tolerate the demands of running. And this might not necessarily present in an acute form the day after, but it could be a secondary soft tissue injury, or God forbid, a recurrent knee injury later down the line. And this isn't just a physical setback or a chronological setback, but it's a huge psychological setback on what is perceived as a big milestone to the athlete. So we need to be aware that practicing running doesn't get you better at running. It conditions your cardiovascular system to cope with running more effectively and efficiently. But what are the physical and technical competencies that we need to prime in our athlete to prepare the musculoskeletal system for the field, to facilitate performance and mitigate injury risk. So that brings us on to the million-dollar question that every athlete wants to know is, when can I run? And at 12 weeks, this is a common chronological marker post-op protocol that surgeons, orthopedic surgeons, are giving athletes as a guideline as when they can get back to running. And is this really sufficient? We have to consider that sometimes it can take up to 4 weeks to quieten the knee, manage the acute post-operative inflammatory process. That leaves us with 8 weeks to train and develop a whole spectrum of athletic competencies. And for the level of adaptation and motor learning required to restore athletic normality and ability to run, this time frame is just not sufficient. It's just not feasible. And to make it clear, when I talk about running, I'm not referring to jogging. Jogging isn't beneficial to anyone, especially the footballer. Running slow is not a prerequisite to running fast. In fact, we know that maybe the slower you run or jog, you actually might experience increased ground reaction forces around the knee, as well as adopting an unnatural gait pattern. So when I talk about preparing the athlete to run, I'm talking about the reconditioning the body's active stiffness properties and retraining the elasticity of the muscle tendon unit, as running, in my opinion, is essentially a series of alternate unilateral plyometric contacts repeated over time. And retraining of this cannot happen over 12 weeks. So the process has to be criteria-led, not chronologically led. And I love this, this graphic from Adam Meekins. I use it a lot, and I show it a lot to my athletes at the start of the long process recovering from surgery, and discuss with them. And we know that rehabilitation rarely progresses in a linear fashion, and there are often peaks and troughs. But through detailed planning and attention to detail and really sound clinical reasoning, can we mitigate the number of setbacks? By asking ourselves, what are the demands of running? What does our athlete that is ready to run look like? And Ebony touched on this really nicely, identifying the end goal. I've alluded to some of the athletic competencies needed, but how are we going to assess these competencies? It's important as a physio that we have the end goal at the forefront of our minds. And in this sake, for this sake, in this case study, our end goal is running. This is important because our early exercise prescription sets the foundations for the S&C coach to build upon. What are we going to program to help them get to that stage as a physio? What's going to make a difference in the early stages? And to understand that, we have to understand that the running gait cycle and what is happening through the gait cycle at initial contact, mid-stance, and propulsion. So looking at this in more detail, what are the demands on the musculoskeletal system during running? First and foremost, we need to recognize that the body has to tolerate ground reaction forces of anything between 2 and 7 times their body weight. This is critical in gaining an appreciation of the level we need to condition these guys to before they can take their first steps on the field. And Simon's presentation with the calf case study is a great example, and visualize this really nicely at the level we need to train these guys before they can run. They need to be able to attenuate, transfer, and redistribute this ground reaction force, with the tendon working like a spring, storing elastic energy and releasing kinetic energy. And again, Simon touched on it again, the ability to produce not only vertical, but horizontal forces. And then we know from Dawn's work in 2014, that as running speeds progress, there's a shift in muscle recruitment strategies. So we need to consider this. For speeds up to around 7 meters a second, so almost a sprint, the dominant strategy is to push on the ground forcefully to increase stride length. And the major ankle plantar flexors, the soleus and the gastroc, play a primary role in this regard. And then as speeds progress, beyond 7 meters a second, the force generating capacity of the plantar flexors becomes less effective. And then the dominant strategy shifts towards increasing ground contact times and increasing stride frequency. This is achieved by generating substantially more power around the hip joint, increasing the demand on the iliopsoas, glute max, rectum, and hamstrings. And then, of course, we need to be able to do this as quickly as possible. Absorbing force, producing force in vertical and horizontal directions in minimal time possible, whilst maintaining stability on one leg and maintaining lumbo-pelvic control. And putting all this in sync will help to optimize performance and minimize the risk of re-injury. So what as physios can we do to contribute early to this process and to set the foundations? And to understand this and understand how we can be most effective, we have to move away from this traditional model of injury rehabilitation and move towards this model, a model of opportunity, looking for early windows to raise the ceiling of athletic capacity. And these are 4 pillars that I use to help work towards that philosophy as a physio. First and foremost, we want to ensure the knee joint is quiet. Let's restore joint homeostasis. This is a key driver for a good outcome, both from my clinical experience and also supported by the evidence base. We want to limit initial muscle atrophy, but then start to facilitate hypertrophy through specific exercise prescription. We want to maintain neural drive. We know ACL injury is a neurological insult as well as a physical insult. So we need to consider early strategies to develop proprioception, cognitive and motor recruitment strategies, all of which rely heavily on the body's neural system and function. And then, of course, we need to restore movement quality and movement health through principles of motor learning to restore athleticism. So if we start with joint homeostasis, again, the primary driver and the primary initial responsibility of the physio, in my opinion. How can we achieve this? How can we quieten the knee in the early phases? Well, we need to minimize the joint effusion, of course. The inflammatory process is a natural part of healing, but we want to limit this and minimize it in the early phases. And I've found using double skins, so wearing 2 pairs of skins immediately post-op through the early phases is really beneficial in getting the effusion down. It can be pretty uncomfortable. The players can complain of being pretty hot at night, but if they can tolerate it, it works really nicely. And then complementing that with the game ready overnight, 30 minutes on, 30 minutes off, again, if they can tolerate it in their sleep. And then using the Normatec regularly throughout the day, we'll always encourage our players to buy one of these. That I feel they're invaluable in those early phases. Again, we'll have players sit on them for 2-3 hours in the evening while they're relaxing in front of the television or playing PlayStation, whatever they do. And then, of course, the importance of hydrotherapy. The effects of the hydrostatic pressure of the pool and lymphatic drainage is invaluable. Getting waterproof dressings on and getting them in the pool as soon as possible to move not only helps with the joint effusion, but improves confidence. And then, of course, work from the MDT to give nutritional support with natural anti-inflammatory foods. Encouraging early knee extension, again, through active interventions as opposed to passive interventions. I'm not a fan of passive knee mobilizations. I think at best, you don't achieve anything. At worst, you irritate the fat pad and can irritate the graft. So through active interventions, restore early knee extension. And that usually comes hand in hand with getting the joint effusion down. Ditching the brace, I think the modern orthopedic surgeon is getting better at not prescribing braces post-op unless there's been an accompanying meniscal or maybe collateral ligament injury. And we can replace a brace with good early neuromuscular training. And then, of course, restoring cross-sectional area and tone of local muscles. And I'll talk about some of the strategies that I might use to develop that early on. But again, part of this return to running model is identifying the needs of running and ensuring that we have sufficient joint motion. Not only important for the technical demands of running, but also range of motion is a key driver in the kinetic chain's ability to absorb ground reaction force on initial contact. We can use the early phases of rehab where the athlete is still load compromised to focus on early mobility drills. The pool is a really useful tool here. And then as the athlete's work capacity increases, we continue to work through the necessary ranges of motion via multi-joint compound series, wall drills, and gymnastic-based movements. I really like the lunge series in this sense. The lunge is essentially transferring weight from one leg to another with the front foot in triple flexion and the back leg, if cued, into triple extension. And then we start to see and mimic the shapes of running. From there, we can add trunk rotations, side flexions, overhead, Bosch type challenges, perturbations, and we start to challenge motor control and stability in a split stance position. And then how can we influence muscle cross-sectional area? I feel as physios as a whole, traditionally our main concern is minimizing muscle loss and atrophy, but can we change this and be positive, put a positive spin on the early phase and look to increase muscle cross-sectional area? We know it's a key determinant in the kinetic chain's ability to produce force during running. Therefore, we want to ensure, yes, that we minimize muscle atrophy, but also look to redevelop this. We know arthrogenic muscle inhibition can be detrimental to the ability to put on muscle bulk. So like I said, restore joint homeostasis, quieten the knee, and then we can progress from there. We know from the evolving evidence that time under tension seems to be a key variable in creating a hypertrophy stimulus, and that intensity in contraction mode is less important as long as we are working the muscle to fatigue. And this is great news for our post-operative knees, where joint loading may need to be considered. So we can look to utilize neuromuscular electric stimulation and blood flow restrictive training to work isolated muscle groups to fatigue using low external loads. And then a note on the use of BFR in early phases post-op. Although there is an abundance of literature to support its use in the early phases, what the literature does not document very well is the level of effusion present at the time of intervention in the intervention groups. And clinically, this is so important for me as to whether BFR is successful in the early phases. Anecdotally, I have found that being too aggressive with BFR too early on can irritate knee effusions, which we obviously do not want. So it's something definitely to consider. We must continue to train the contralateral uninjured leg and train it heavy, as it's another option to develop cross-sectional area and develop neural drive in the uninjured leg. We know from training the contralateral leg that we can get up to a 20% crossover in strength to the injured side via neurological crossover pathways. I think isometrics are a really good option in the early phases of rehab when predominantly the physio is overseeing the programming. High intensity, yielding and overcoming isometrics are really good options where we can get high neural drive at specific joint angles with minimal axial load or joint stress. We can also use this time to influence muscle strength of other key muscle groups required for running away from the knee. Tibant, soleus, gastroc, the foot intrinsics and hip cuff are all important and important in mitigating load from the knee during running, as they all help to dissipate ground reaction force on initial contact during the gait cycle. And then restoring athletic function. How do we do this? Returning our athlete to athletic normality and restoring movement health, movement options and function is the underpinning goal of our reconditioning strategy as we look to return them to running. I've spoken a lot about the underlying physical qualities they require for this, but we must consider it's not always about programming reps and sets to drill home physiological adaptation. We also need to create an environment for the athlete to undergo motor learning and skill acquisition. Because in my opinion, athletic competency and function is the sum of strength, motor control, and skill all combined. And to develop movement health, we need to understand the basic principles behind successful motor learning and skill acquisition. First and foremost, we need to appreciate that we can manipulate our training load, task, and environment. I alluded to the variables of a lunge series previously, and I know Sam Blanchard is going to touch on how we can manipulate these variables really nicely in his webinar later today. Every exercise does not have to look perfect. We have to encourage variable practice and variable movements through our rehab to ensure that these motor learning patterns are ingrained. And the research will tell us that if we're not failing the athlete and they're not failing at around 20% of their exercises, then the task we're giving them isn't challenging enough. And then the skill or movement retention may be lost. We need to have an artillery of both progressions and regressions at hand to ensure we are creating an optimum environment for motor relearning. I look to use a constraints-led approach using cues that are successful for keeping their attention, maintaining intensity, and achieving desired task outcomes. This is usually via external cueing, although we have to appreciate that this may differ from athlete to athlete. And although we are preparing the athlete to run a predominantly sagittal task, we need to challenge the body to move through all three planes of motion with confidence and fluidity. And we need to watch for cheating. The ACL athlete is brilliant at cheating and will offload whenever they can. So we need to be watchful for cheating strategies, as Simon alluded to, using the coach's eye. In particular, they will like to adopt a hip dominant strategy. So can we create an environment using a constraints-led approach to address this? Because ultimately, the athlete is going to load their knee during their sport. And we need to create an environment where we encourage this. And it's exposing these athletes to these body weight challenges, these movement puzzles on a daily basis, over and over, which helps to build joint integrity and soft tissue tolerance, capacity, and resilience. And then again, as Simon alluded to, are they owning this process? Are they doing it over and over again with no reaction on a daily and weekly basis? If the answer is yes, then maybe we are starting to gain an appreciation that the system is capable of tolerating these high loads associated with running, and that the athlete is getting ready to return to the field. Some examples there: A-frame work, lunge series, step-up series, wall drills, leaning tower and sway drills are all examples of drills I like to use in this movement preparation phase. I'm not able to share any videos in this presentation because simply just haven't got the time to cover it, but would be willing to share any of those if people are interested. And then we have to consider rate of force development early on in the process, something that might be alien to us as physios, where we just look at strength predominantly. Because we know from many studies that at 6 months, we still see up to 30% deficits in rate of force development. And this is sometimes only restored as late as 12 months. This sits in two places with me. It reaffirms these guys need significant reconditioning times, but it also makes me wonder if we can introduce RFD work earlier. And in my experience, introducing basic active stiffness drills has helped to restore RFD quicker. It's provided a really nice base for the S&C coach to work with. And we can see from the data here the importance of the ability to be able to produce force quickly and produce active stiffness, not only for running, but also to protect against future ACL injury. Because remember, we are returning the athlete to run, not to plod or jog. So this dynamic joint stiffness is so important, not only for joint protection, but of course performance. It allows for shorter contact times and develops reactive strength. So max strength scores alone and measurements of peak torque are not enough. And I've been guilty of that many times in the past, of recognizing, look, the athletes produce some really nice peak torques on the IKD, on the Nord board, but are they able to produce this force quickly? And we can see that when we look at these two differing athletes. Athlete A is capable of producing higher levels of force than athlete B, but athlete B is better at producing force at shorter time frames. So if you ask me which one is better protected and better prepared for running and protected against a future ACL injury, it's definitely athlete B. So what can we prescribe to help with this? As I said, early overcoming isometrics at specific joint angles can be a really nice way of priming the body for the demands of running. Leg press switches, wall drills, A-frame switches can all be done from an early phase with body weight loads. Cocky walks and pogos, ankling type drills prescribed for active foot and ankle drills and for producing force quickly around the ankle. Bounding, skipping and hopping progressions are also really nice drills. And then I've utilized the watt bikes to mimic the joint demands and picking up cadence through the joints to replicate the demands of running. And on the trampette, where ground reaction forces are initially lower, but we start to get that high motor recruitment through quick joint and muscle actions. And then rope skipping, we can see from this graph here that skipping is a really nice precursor to running, not obviously matching the reactive strength demands, but getting close to it. So it's a nice, form skipping is a really nice way of preparing the athlete to run, and there are many variations of this. So what other considerations as a physio do I think about in these early phases? Well, for sure, I want to restore the integrity of the graft site, whether that be a hamstring, a quad graft, a patella graft. It's really important that we focus on restoring the integrity of the graft site through specific exercise prescriptions to avoid compensatory patterns. I look to prescribe single leg exercises as early as possible to mimic the sport specific movement patterns. And then, of course, we have to consider the neurocognitive and perceptual elements to training, always looking to challenge the athlete, as well as prescribing programs to develop physiological adaptations. While we're doing this, can we train the brain? Can we train decision making? And I'm constantly conscious of this. And this field is emerging definitely with ACL research. And then communication between all stakeholders, as everyone's alluded to today, is really important for a successful outcome. I've found in the outcomes that haven't been successful that we haven't communicated as well as a team, and the successful cases, everyone has had a say in the programming, and that's inclusive of the athlete, had a say in the program, and that comes down to considering the athlete. Sexy programming, and it's all very well talking about these principles and clinical reasoning, but if the athlete isn't compliant with these and they're not motivated by the program, then the program is useless. So consider the athlete, sit down with them, talk with them, I've asked them before what they like doing, what don't they like doing, to try and keep them engaged throughout the process. And I think this is really important. And again, as everyone's alluded to today, they have to own the process. They have to do all these things on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, to show that they can really own these exercises, as opposed to a traditional tick box where we're seeing someone do one movement or a series of movements. Okay, they've done that, let's move on to the next phase. That's not testing the joint integrity and the tissue tolerance associated with running. We need to do this day in, day out for weeks before we decide that they're ready to run. So to summarize, we need to envision the end goal and recognize the demands of the sport and the specificity of the skills within that sport. And that really underpins our clinical reasoning. Breaking down the tasks, how can I contribute to the end goal? What's going to make a difference? And really honing in on the detail early on sets the foundations really nicely for later in the process. In the early phases as a physio, restoration of knee joint homeostasis is my #1 priority. And failure to do this at an early stage can cause so many problems later down the line. Nobody wants to play tug of war with an irritable knee, offloading, reloading, taking anti-inflammatories, holding them back, reintroducing load. It's just a nightmare scenario for everyone to deal with, and a really miserable situation. So take your time to restore knee joint health, even if that's taken 10 to 14 days pre-op to quieten the knee. Let's get it quiet. Then we've got a great base to work from. How can we influence muscle architecture? Not just minimizing atrophy. Let's feel positive as physios that we can make a difference, and we're not just simply trying to limit muscle loss. Can we upregulate neural drive and prepare the athlete for rate of force development and reactive strength index development earlier than we traditionally have through basic RFD exercises? And then can we apply the principles of motor learning and skill acquisition to prepare them to run day in, day out, over weeks, not days, to ensure that they have the right capacity to return to the field? Okay, guys, that's me. Thanks for listening. I hope everyone got something from that.